Acknowledging Professor Wood's words about the need for love and opening the heart, we are going to be including, as part of our program, some poets. And adding that dimension of art, we have as our first poet, before we go into our first panel this morning, a young man named Taylor Maxey. And he's been working with a group called Street Poets that teaches writing and teaches poetry both in youth camps, also to youth who are on the outside, to people who are victims of crime, people who are affected by the violence in our communities on all sides. And their experience has been that this poetry brings healing to people and the people that they know. So we have brought Taylor Maxey all the way out from Las Vegas, Nevada, to be with us today. He's an educator himself. He's a mentor himself. He's done some very, very important work through poetry and through his attention to other young people and through sharing about his experiences growing up. So please join me in welcoming Taylor Maxey.
How you guys doing? Thanks for the warm welcome. And as he said, my name is Taylor Maxey, and I'm just here to basically share a piece that I wrote that kind of takes you on the journey that I went through when I was growing up, living the street life, and that eventually led into my own healing. And it's called Not Too Many. I got so much rage in the bank, I'm living large off the interest. An investment trust account, reaping the perks of big business. But before I self-destruct and let the wealth tear me apart, let me splurge for a minute and get some burden off my heart. I don't know how to start because it's dark and runs deep. Back to that demon I first saw when my parents were both asleep. I swear it only seems like it was just yesterday when Pops threw Mama in the tub with blood gushing from her face. That was a quarter century ago, but I'm still hearing screams. In my cell yelling no because they echo in my dreams. Mama took me off to Texas when the dope took you under. And it was there I got molested and my sunshine turned to thunder. Reflecting on these troubles, sometimes my tears become laughs. Because you had the nerve to wonder why I chose to walk a dark path. My last hope was the streets, so I banged the local gang. But that even took something I can never again claim. Can the Lord blame me for all the sins I committed? Or close the pearly gates because I lacked the wisdom to do different? I wanted the world to feel the kind of pain I was feeling. So I robbed and pistol whipped a man in front of his own children. And to make matters worse, the homie showed me love for that. Celebrating all the hate that I now wish I could take back. Was it the Haldol and codeine that ran through Mama's veins, mixed with the dope and daddy's semen that made me grow to be insane? And when I felt the urge to change, my enemies cashed me out with slugs and left me leaking in the street talking to God about peace. My scars tell a story that only pauses for effect as I choke off the gun smoke, praying to take another breath. I'd be lying if I said I never cried in the cell, because I'm forced to face the truth walking the main line in jail. It's hell to be alone and prevail against these thoughts, but I'm thankful for the chance, because I was way too lost. I ain't know how good it felt to smile till I was on the verge of death, with 30 staples in my stomach and half a dozen in my neck. It's obvious that I'm blessed because I can still draw some breath, but it's also clear that I'm cursed to bear the burden of such stress. When I was alone as a kid, I used to dream so much, I lost touch with reality, kept my eyes wide shut. But the kiss from 2 guns is what disturbed that eternal bliss. I wanted to be like Mike. I never did picture this. If I had to formulate the words and explain the world to my daughter, it'd probably take some Hail Marys and a fifth of holy water. Am I wrong for wanting to tell her these ugly facts we tend to hide? Or should I keep my mouth shut and hope she finds a way to rise? I treasure times like this when the truth invades my spirit. But the sad thing is, not too many want to hear it.
I'll promise we'll bring the Kleenex very soon. Thank you, Taylor. So we're going to be moving now into our first panel, and we're really, really honored to have our moderator, Ellen Eggers, Judge Arthur Alarcon, Jeannie Woodford, and Michael Brady. They have, all of them, incredible biographies that it would take the length of the panel for me to really do justice for. So please, if you open your programs, you can read about them and the incredible work that they've done and that they do. But that said, we're just going to go right into it, and please join me in welcoming this panel.
Hello, everyone. I am so pleased to be here. I'm still sniffling from all the presentations today, starting with Scott's. I've been told not to introduce these panelists and give a little background, but I'm going to take the liberty of giving you just a pinch here. First of all, Justice Alarcon, I'll make it very brief, but he is a senior Ninth Circuit justice, and I told him today this is the first time I've been in the presence of a Ninth Circuit justice other than from behind the bench, which is a much different experience. So I am so honored to have him here today. This is my first day meeting him. And next to Justice Alarcon is Jeannie Woodford, who was the warden of San Quentin Prison a number of years ago at a time when one of my clients, a death row inmate by the name of Manny Babbitt, was executed. Jeannie presided as the warden at that time over that execution. So that was the first I know of Jeannie. Now I know Jeannie as the director of Death Penalty Focus, an organization devoted to abolishing the death penalty, on which I am a board member. So I am so pleased to know Jeannie in both those capacities. And finally, Mr. Michael Brady, who was a criminal defense attorney for many years, spent 2 years in state prison, and then found himself very high up in the Department of Corrections, and now is a deputy commissioner for the Board of Prison Hearings. It would take a whole day to go back into his entire career. As you can see, it's varied. I am so pleased to have him here. My role as moderator is simply to lay out the program and keep people on time. I will tell you for your benefit, we will have each of our speakers give a 10-minute response to the question, how might principles of restorative justice be used to imagine a criminal justice system without the death penalty? Each panelist has been asked to prepare just 10 minutes to respond to that, so that will take a half hour. And then each panelist will ask one question of another panelist, and they will respond. And then we will open up the last half hour for questions from the audience, so a total of an hour and a half. Okay, with that, I would like to begin by introducing Justice Alarcon.
Thank you. When I became a member of the Ninth Circuit, I found out that we were called judges, not justices. And in fact, one of my colleagues would frighten brand new lawyers by saying, if they said Justice Ely, he'd say, there is no justice on the Ninth Circuit. I've been asked to lead off and give some background about what is happening in California today with reference to the death penalty. My background has led me to being interested and concerned with the death penalty. I started off after law school as a prosecutor here in Los Angeles County, and I handled some death penalty cases as a prosecutor. I later went to work for Governor Pat Brown as his clemency secretary, and one of my duties was to advise him about whether he should grant clemency or commute death penalty cases. I later became a Superior Court judge here in Los Angeles County and presided over death penalty cases. And then I became a justice of the California Court of Appeal. I was a justice at one time. And in that role, I handled first-degree murder appeals. When I was appointed to the Ninth Circuit, I found out that one of our main duties is to preside over habeas corpus petitions filed by condemned prisoners on California's death row and also in other states in the Ninth Circuit, and review whether the state had violated the federal constitutional rights of people on death row, because the federal courts have the power to set aside or to vacate convictions or sentences if there has been a federal constitutional violation. As I started handling those cases as a judge of the Ninth Circuit, I was startled to read editorials in the media about how terrible the justice system was and how the judges were delaying the processing of convictions as well as habeas corpus proceedings, and something had to be done about those crazy liberal judges who are doing that. Also, I read comments from politicians from Sacramento and elsewhere, again, criticizing the judicial system because of the fact that it was taking so long to finally resolve a death penalty appeal and habeas corpus proceedings that follow a death penalty affirmance by the court. So I decided to do some research, and I have working for me an incredible person. She is my career law clerk, and she's seated about 3 rows in front of me, Paula Mitchell, who's also one of the professors at the law school at Loyola. And with her incredible research skills, we did a study in our first article, which we published about 5 years ago, and that article had to do with what is the cause of the delay in the judicial system, both in the state system and also in the federal system. We found in that study that, and I'll give you the punchline now, and that is that we have on paper an effective procedural due process to handle death penalty cases. But what we lack is the substantive part. The procedural part is broken. And our study led us to the conclusion that it's not the fault of the judiciary. Fortunately, I have an appointment for life, so I don't have to worry about some of the comments I make. So I can tell you that the real culprits in terms of the delay in the death penalty system in the state of California is the California legislature, and I will point out facts, hopefully, to support that. We start off with looking at the delay. Where does the delay start? It starts in California because there is an automatic appeal in California directly to the California Supreme Court. And so the California Supreme Court has to appoint lawyers for the direct appeal from the judgment of conviction and, in some cases, the validity of the sentencing decision? Well, because the California legislature has not properly funded the money necessary to appoint lawyers, it takes the California Supreme Court 4 years to be able to find lawyers for people on death row. Now picture yourself in San Quentin on death row, sitting there for 4 years with nobody talking to you, with no lawyer, before finally, after 4 years, somebody comes in and says, I'm the lawyer who's going to represent you. Let's talk about your conviction. That's one of the delay points. Now, the legislature appointed a commission on the fair administration of criminal justice headed by a wonderful man, John Van de Kamp. The Senate created that commission, and that commission recommended to the legislature that they increase the funding of the state public defender and also the Human Death Penalty Resource Center, which is part of the Supreme Court. And the Death Penalty Research Center lawyers represent condemned prisoners in habeas corpus proceedings, both within the state and also in the federal side. The commission recommended that the budget for the public defender's office be increased and recommended a huge increase in the number of lawyers for the Habeas Corpus Research Center. When it was started, there were, I think, 32 or 35 lawyers. The number has never been increased. The legislature ignored the wonderful report of the commission that it appointed, and there is no increase in the funding for those lawyers. So the Supreme Court is saddled with the responsibility of trying to talk lawyers into representing people on death row, and that's taken 4 years. The next problem that we noted in terms of delay is that 25% of the Supreme Court's business is handling death penalty cases. That means that the civil side is suffering terribly because they're devoting so much time to that. Because of the pressure on the 7 members of the California Supreme Court, it is taking over 10 years, approaching, in some cases, 15 years, and in a recent case of Richard Ramirez, 17 years to do the processing to handle the direct appeal. Richard Ramirez did not find out that his case had been affirmed for 17 years after it went to the California Supreme Court. Richard Ramirez is now in habeas corpus proceedings, and he has been on death row approaching 25 years. And my guess is he'll be there before all of that is finished, perhaps after 30 years. That's what's happening. Again, because the California legislature has not done anything, and you heard the Chief Justice talking about the 30% cut in their budget on everything for the courts, but the legislature has not done what our study recommended, that instead of having a direct appeal go to the California Supreme Court, we've got over 100 California Court of Appeal justices who handled first-degree murder cases where there was no death penalty. So they go there if it's life without parole or life imprisonment. And they are perfectly capable of handling those direct appeals. And we recommended that the Constitution be amended to permit review, discretionary review by the California Supreme Court. The legislature has done nothing to address that problem. We also found that habeas corpus proceedings in California, and the Chief Justice mentioned that, go directly to the California Supreme Court. This is the only state that does that. The model in the federal system is the habeas corpus goes back to the trial court that found the individual guilty of a death penalty offense. It then goes to in this circuit to my circuit, and we review it, and then there is discretionary review with the California Supreme Court. So again, the legislature has done nothing, has ignored recommendations from the former Chief Justice, Justice Ronald George, and the current Chief Justice recently indicated that those changes that we recommended in terms of their caseload must be addressed. I want to close because I've been given a note to shut up quickly.
I don't usually get to do this to judges.
One of the observations, and we're supposed to be talking about restorative justice, one of the things that I found out early on in my years in the district attorney's office is in looking at probation reports, and then later on I was a member of the California Parole Board and looking at parole reports, that most of the people that come through the criminal justice system have had experience with the law, many of them starting in school. And the teachers that I know have told me they can spot a 7 or 8 year old who is going to be in trouble in the future because of their behavior, mental problems, emotional problems, or what have you. Well, what has happened in the criminal justice system is we don't focus on those kids in school, and we don't have a program to help those kids and their families so that they don't end up at age 12 stealing a car, at 15 or 16 becoming dope addicts, at 18 robbing their first victim, and maybe at 24 or 25 finally being sent to prison, where after they're 25, then we start looking at the background and what it is that caused this person to do these things. Much too late. So I would feel we should direct our resources not at, now we have spent, and Professor Mitchell found out for us, since 1978 we've spent $4 billion resulting in the execution of 13 persons. How much of that, how much could have been accomplished spending that money working with children who have a potential for committing crimes, who could possibly be directed away from that by attention at that level? And now I'll shut up.
Well, that was a lesson in how to end perfectly on time. And now I would like to turn it over to Ms. Jeannie Woodford.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today, and I certainly want to thank Justice Alarcon and Paula Mitchell for their report. It has done so much to educate Californians about the cost of the death penalty and how it impacts all of us. It impacts what we pay for our colleges even in this state. So I'm going to approach the topic today and talk about the death penalty from the point of view of being a warden and what it's like to carry out an execution and what I learned during my time at San Quentin. And so I want to begin by saying I've always been against the death penalty. So we can set that aside. But when you're in criminal justice, and particularly running a prison or involved in the prison, in any way, it isn't your job to judge. In fact, when judges used to come through the prison with the Judges College, I would always say this joke that they never laughed at, is that I can say something you can't. I'm not here to judge. And that was true. So you really carry out sentences and you think about yourself as being a professional and not thinking about sentences, but carrying out the sentences in the most humane way possible. I started at San Quentin in 1978, 2 weeks after graduating from Sonoma State University with a degree in criminal justice. Pretty liberal background, I have to tell you. So when I started there were just a couple of people on death row. When I left in 2004 to go to Sacramento to be the director of corrections, there were a little over 650 people on death row. And today we have 722. And that includes, and we always forget the women on death row. 15 women housed at Central California Women's Facility, and I think it's important to know that there are women in this system as well, because their issues are very different than men in many respects. I carried out 4 executions of the 13. And so I just want to have you think about what that's like. I describe it this way. You get that death warrant 30 to 60 days prior to the scheduled execution. So you get up in the morning 30 to 60 days prior to that execution, and you get dressed, and you hug your husband goodbye, and you say to your kids, have a great day at school, and then you get in your car, and you drive, for me, 28 miles to work, knowing that you're going there to plan to kill a human being on behalf of the state of California. It is a very long drive. And in that drive, you try to think about, try to make sense of this. Why are we doing it? Is it about justice? Is it about fairness? Having been at San Quentin for almost 27 years, I read thousands of inmate files. And early in my career, you could read a file and say, this guy probably got the death sentence, and you look, and it was true. But as the death penalty evolved and more crimes fell under special circumstances, that was no longer the case. I mean, from one county to another, the disparity was all over the place, not to mention the other kind of disparities that we all know about. But again, you're driving to work trying to make sense of this. And then as the warden, it's not only your job to go there to plan to kill a human being, it is your job to go there and lead your staff through that. And staff at a prison, you know, they're Catholic, they're Muslim, they have all points of view about this issue. But it is your job to convince them that they're doing the right thing. And then there is that night of the execution. And part of your job is to train your staff to kill a human being. And you go there that night and you put on that leaderly face, and everyone comes to the prison and all the drama that surrounds that, and you know this only too well. Victims' family members show up. Many have been shamed to come to the prison. They've been told that if you don't come, the governor might grant clemency. I have seen this from from all points of view, and none of it is pretty. I tell people at the end of every execution, one of my staff would say something like, is society safer because of what we did tonight? And we never answered the question because we knew it wasn't true. We hadn't done anything to make it better. We never asked, is society better off because we have the death penalty? Because we also knew the answer to that question. So when you ask the question, how might restorative justice principle be used to imagine a criminal justice system without the death penalty, I think before this state can ever get beyond punishment is the only purpose of prisons, which our penal code still says today, that we have to get rid of the death penalty. Because we can't get to a system that is restorative as long as people think that retribution is okay in our society. And, you know, I was brought to Sacramento. How much time do I have? 4 minutes. So I was brought to Sacramento by Governor Schwarzenegger to bring rehabilitation to the Department of Corrections. And so in 2006, we added that word, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. The inmates will tell you that the R is silent. But in trying to do that, we approached the legislature and said, we have to change the purpose of prisons, because it still says in the penal code the purpose of prisons is punishment. And what do you get for punishment? Does that have anything really to do with public safety, really? You know, when you have a prison system, it really, 95% of people come back to our society. And so you have to have a system that's preparing people to return to our society in an appropriate way. And I think the only way we'll ever get there is to really rethink what we are about as a society, what we expect. And I believe, 30 years in law enforcement, I absolutely believe in accountability, but you don't need to have the death penalty to have accountability. I absolutely believe that we need to have a system that considers victims and does so much more than we do for them now. And when you talk about trying to understand why people commit the crimes that they commit, you know, when inmates who have the death penalty walk into a prison, I sat on every classification hearing when I was warden, and prior to that, many of them, you can't even talk to them about why they did what they did, because they're in the process of appealing. You never get to the truth. And you know, many of the men, because I was at San Quentin, I only dealt with males on death row, would want to talk about it, but you'd have to say, we can't talk to you about your crime. We can't talk to you about that. So imagine what that is like, as you described, coming into a prison. You don't have an attorney or a legal team for several years. It used to be 6 years. Now that it's 4. We never get to truth. And then you have victims' family members who are waiting for what they're told will be closure for 25 or 30 years or more. In some cases, it will never happen. And they never get the answers to their questions, ever. Having seen victims' family members leave the prison after an execution, I can tell you that I never saw anyone who felt that being there brought them any kind of closure whatsoever. And I will close by saying that in the context of restorative justice and its goals, you really can't have a system that has the death penalty. So you are going to have the opportunity to vote on this issue. I do want to make one comment before I get to that, which is this. Lots of people have talked about fixing the death penalty, and even in the Fair Administration of Justice report, it said in that report it would cost $100 million more a year to bring any kind of remedy to what's broken about the system. So in my mind, this system is broken beyond repair, and it's really time to get to a system that holds people accountable but makes our society far better than it is today. And so in November of this year, you will have the opportunity to vote as to whether we should continue to have the death penalty. We have now 800, how many signatures do we have? 800,000 signatures, right? And so we will have enough to qualify for the ballot. And so we're in the process of raising the funds that are necessary to be sure that we can run a campaign. So I hope that you will support our effort. And so thank you so much.
And Mr. Mike Brady, I just want to add to the very first time that I visited my first client on death row, I asked the very same question as I was walking out, the same question that Jeannie asked and her staff asked. Is the world going to be a safer place when my client is strapped down at midnight, and at that time it was the gas chamber, but poison put in their veins? Is the world going to be a safer place? And I think that's the ultimate question with the death penalty. Anyway, I will now move on to Mr. Mike Brady, and if I could ask Jeannie, can you be the monitor of Mr. Brady since you're sitting next to him? And you have 10 minutes, sir. Okay.
Stopwatch.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, lawyers, you
Mr.
give lawyers
Brady.
the floor and they want to talk all day, so
All
I got to
right,
time myself.
Mr. Brady
here.
will monitor himself.
Right. So I have a unique perspective, and I had forgotten how emotional this topic is for me until Jeannie brought up the execution process. So excuse me if I'm a little bit emotional about it. So I'm going to try to avoid talking about the process of the execution itself and to talk about it in a more theoretical point of view, from a process point of view. I used to support the death penalty. I was a defense lawyer, but I still believe that taking the life of another human being in very rare circumstances was appropriate. I no longer feel that way. I have tried over 100 jury trials, well over 100 jury trials, including 25 homicides and 6 death penalty cases to jury. I have represented a death row inmate, David Edwin Mason, who wished to waive his collateral appeals and to be executed. I actually witnessed David's execution. He was a volunteer, the only volunteer in California in 1993, 19 years ago. And I actually was ordered by the court, or asked by the court, Judge White from San Jose in the district court, to be there because it was a volunteer in case David changed his mind and no longer wished to be executed. Warden Vasquez was the warden back then, and Jeannie was actually working at the prison when that execution took place. Witnessing the death of another human being is a very traumatic experience, not just for the people. There are witnesses there, there are family members there, the press is there, and it is an experience like no other. We all talk about believing in the death penalty, or many people talk about believing in the death penalty from an abstract perspective. But when you actually go through the process from beginning to end, I was a defense lawyer, I tried cases, I argued for people's lives. It is an awesome and very difficult responsibility. And a question for Judge Alicon, frankly, is should the standard of ineffective assistance to counsel be raised in death penalty cases given the ultimate finality of it, because the standard is so low in effective assistance to counsel in Strickland versus Washington and the state standard and the old cases of People versus Pope and progeny. It seems to me that the standard ought to be much higher for that ineffective assistance to counsel. So I suffered from the experience of 30 years of witnessing the rage, hurt, resentment, single-mindedness of the punishment model of the criminal justice system and prison system. I served myself 2 years in state prison as a civil addict, as a narcotics offender. I experienced addiction. I've been sober for 12 years continuously, and I've been the product of redemption, forgiveness, and the restoration of trust. If there's anything you can count on that'll make you drink is watching another person die in the gas chamber. I've held high-level policy positions in the legislature and the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitations for 12 years. When I was living in a recovery home in Sacramento, after I got out I was homeless. I look homeless today. I was homeless. I had been on the street for a long time. I went to prison and got out. I was still homeless. I had $200. They kicked me out the gate. No place to go. And so when I got out of the civil addict program, the mandatory program was I live in a recovery home. And a friend of mine, Rusty Arrayes, called me while I was in the recovery home. He says, "What can I do for you, Mike?" And I said, "You can get me a job. You can help get me a job. I'm homeless. I have really, nowhere to go." So he called someone, Senator John Burton, President of the Senate from San Francisco, and got me an interview. I had to borrow a suit, went down and had a prison haircut. Those top ramen haircuts is a little longer over here than it is over here. And I interviewed with him, and he gave me a job. I was a senior public policy consultant for him for 6 years. I wrote the Lawyers Assistance Program for the State Bar of California for lawyers who are chemically dependent and mentally ill to get help rather than being disbarred. I stayed there. Believe it or not, the Department of Corrections was my subject area, and the Board of Parole hearings, even though I was on active parole. You can imagine how popular I was. I was appointed by Governor Davis to be Deputy Secretary of Corrections in 2003. And you can imagine how popular I was then. I was the number 3 in corrections. Back then it was 11 people, Secretary Presley, Undersecretary, and myself. I have a deep and abiding understanding of the criminal justice system and all of those things that go along with it. So let me talk about restorative justice. I see a great opportunity here to develop it, but I also see some major challenges. First and foremost, it has to become the principles of restorative justice have to become part of mainstream criminal justice thinking rather than a boutique concept. We're here today, we're talking to like-minded people. How many of you are supportive of the death penalty? So here we are talking to like-minded people, right? I mean, there are a few, but we need to change that conversation and start talking with victims groups. We need to get victims at the table, and this is one of the things that Jeannie's really good at. She's an advocate for victims, and we need to have them here at this table with us discussing that problem. We don't do that, and we need to change that. Prominent people, including the Justice of the Federal Courts, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, governor, senators, assemblymen, sheriffs, all of these prominent people need to come out and embrace the principles of restorative justice in order for it to become mainstream thought. Does it mean that every person who's in prison should be involved in restorative justice? No, it doesn't mean that at all. We need to do some creaming, meaning that we need to figure out and screen inmates to determine who is amenable to that, which victims' families are amenable to that, and put those folks together and have some successes in order for it to work. But as long as it stays much like the drug courts were, much like the mental health courts were, much like the therapeutic courts were, if it stays a boutique concept that's not funded adequately, it's not going to go anywhere. We're going to be having the same conversation 20 years from now. I served on the Administrative Office of the Courts, Prop 36 Committee, Therapeutic Justice Courts Committee, back in 2001. Restorative justice was a concept back then. Has it gone anywhere? Very, very, not very far, right? Third, we must be willing to embrace the principles of restorative justice for the most serious of crimes and behavior, not just low-level offenders. What we do, what the science says, is the big bang for your buck comes from treating high-risk offenders, not from low risk. Low risk should be, we're wasting our money on low-risk inmates. We need to go with the high-risk inmates. Does this mean that that we should start at death row with restorative principles? I think that's a difficult conversation, and I'll tell you why. Because when names like Bonin and Ramirez and Farley and Carpenter come to mind, it is going to be difficult for the public to accept that people who have killed multiple people, brutal killings, should be the subject of restorative justice. So I think we need to really be selective. Are there some people on death row because of the expansion of the death penalty that it was episodic for them? I think so. I think there are people on there that, while the crime was heinous, that it may have been an isolated situation that they find themselves in, otherwise law-abiding life. It's rare, though, in a death case. But we might consider under 1170D of the Penal Code, with the agreement of the family, a more modest approach, and that is to take a select, maybe one is eligible to go back, much like the restorative justice bill for the SB 9 that Javier and the restorative justice, Harvey Starling and Father Mike. 10 minutes is up. All right. So that's not going to work. Let's talk about, if you did abolish the death penalty, what happens then? Everybody's life without. So where's the hope in the life without? Okay? So in my view, we ought to take 1170D and make it applicable to, 1170D of the Penal Code allows, upon the agreement of the Secretary of Corrections, I think the prosecutor and some other people, that they can recall this sentence back to Superior Court and resentence them. So you can imagine that there are a lot of LWOPs in the state of California. We have over 38,000 lifers in the California prison system. That's about 4 prisons full of lifers. And I think we have about 10,000 LWOPs, maybe 7,000 LWOPs. I'm not sure how many LWOPs there are. How many LWOPs are there?
Like
3,000? Okay, 3,000 LWOPs. But anyway, the idea is start modest, because if you don't start modest, you need some successes, so start modestly. So I can tell you from personal experience that the system...
You have to do it in 1 minute.
Okay. The system of criminal justice is full of wounded individuals, victims, offenders, hurt masked by anger, resentment, violence, and pain. So the question is, who here is ready and willing and able to step up and make this a reality? Because you really have to get out there and start advocating for it. It starts within, and we need to start having these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Now we have an opportunity for each of the panelists to ask one question of another panelist. And Jeannie, if you would like to begin, I believe you have a question for Judge Alarcon.
Thank you. So my question is that you noted in your paper that you turned in for this event that if we were to continue to utilize the death penalty as a punishment, it must be fixed, and that's my words, not yours. But we know to fix the death penalty would cost millions more. And when you think of the science of criminal justice that says that the best way to prevent crime is to solve it, do you think that, if you believe that's a fair and accurate statement, should we spend our money on fixing the death penalty or on increasing public protection by solving the 46% of homicides that go unsolved in this state and the 56% of rapes that go unsolved in this state each year?
Well, first of all, let me explain the goal of our both of our reports. I mentioned the first one that came out 5 years ago. We did another one that came out a few months ago that Loyola Law School published. We wanted the public, we wanted the voters to know the truth. And we believed that it was clear that the voters had not been told the truth whenever an initiative increasing the type of activity that would call for the death penalty would come up. The state agencies that were supposed to tell you in your ballot what something has cost were not telling you the facts. They were not giving any indication as to the cost. So we wanted the voters to understand that $4 billion has been spent since 1978. It costs $180 million a year because we have a death penalty in housing these people. We wanted the public to know that so the public could decide, do we want to continue having a death penalty knowing these facts? We also recommended that there be other considerations that the public might be interested in. For example, there are many people who are concerned that innocent people might be executed. We recommended that the public should think about, if there is going to be a death penalty, that there be chemical tests like a DNA, that there be a recorded confession, that there be a filmed reenactment if the defendant wanted to reenact what he did before a jury could come in with the death penalty. We also recommended that it should be considered whether we should cut down the number of crimes of special circumstances that would result in the death penalty. Do I think, to go back to your question, do I think we'd be better served spending our money, as I indicated earlier, trying to detect people who had the potential for committing violent crimes early on and treating them? Do I think it would be a better use of our money to try to solve the crimes that are unsolved, homicides, rapes, and so forth? Yes, I do. But if we're going to continue to have a death penalty, and who knows what the voters will do in November, the voters should realize what it's costing.
Thank you.
I would like to begin questioning of the panel from the audience in about 7 minutes to stay on time at 10 o'clock so that we have a full half hour for questioning. Oh, I'm sorry, 11, yes. Yes, we're an hour. Thank you. But I would also like to open it up to either Judge Alarcon or to Mike Brady if either one of you have a question of a fellow panelist, because we do have a little bit of time.
I have a question to Mr. Brady. If the initiative that will be on the ballot apparently in November goes through, it will provide for life without possibility of parole, and I assume under special circumstances, so the jury would have the choice of life imprisonment if the special circumstances were not there. That means then that those who get life without possibility of parole will be what someone called in the past the worst of the worst, the most vicious crimes committed, depending on what the special circumstances were. I am curious as to how those people, assuming we had life without possibility of parole under special circumstances where a horrible crime had been committed, how we could get that individual to sit down with the family of the victim and have a meaningful discussion.
Well, if it was limited to the worst of the worst, I think it would be a very difficult process. It's difficult to imagine that dream if you limit the scope of that. But if it continues to be as broad as it is, I think that you're still going to have a number of opportunities for victims and families to sit down to have that restorative justice conversation. Will it be all lifers? Will it be the majority of those lifers under the new life without only? No, it probably would be a very small number, but you still have to fight for it. I think if Sister Bridget or Father Mike were here, they'd all tell you, you don't give up. We continue to do that. But I think you're probably going to be more likely to have success with the life with eligibility for parole.
I have just got to respond to this one because I had a personal experience with this very topic. I don't know if Jeannie's thinking of the same case, maybe not, but William Bonin was a very infamous serial killer out of Orange County. They call him the Freeway Killer. Mm-hmm. He was executed in 1996. He was convicted of 14 murders, horrible cases. There were probably many more that he killed, young boys, teenage boys for the most part. He was one of our clients. I worked on the case right prior to his execution. He got a lot of publicity. The lead spokesperson for the victim's family in that case was a woman whose 14-year-old son, Rusty, was murdered by Mr. Bonin. Sandy Miller was her name. And Sandy Miller has been on the cover of some of the news magazines. I think U.S. World and News Report had her on the cover. She was very vehement, as you might expect. She wanted Bonin to burn in hell. Very outspoken. She was the spokesperson for all the victims' family members. She was at the execution. I had the opportunity to speak with her a couple years after Bonin's execution. And I actually had many opportunities to find out about her. I had friends that knew her and had become friends, and I spoke with her. And one of the things that Sandy Miller said is, all those years waiting for Bonin to be executed, she put all of her energy into that. And after it was over, she realized that's when she had to begin the healing process. All those years of hating him and wanting revenge and wanting to see his death, she felt were wasted because now she had nowhere to send all that rage that was still there. She said that's when the healing process had to begin for her. She also, I saw her in a video driving past the home of William Bonin's mother. And in the video, Sandy Miller was saying, one of these days I'm going to get up the courage to knock on her door and meet Mrs. Bonin because we both lost a son. And to me, that was one of the most stunning examples. It took a long, long time to get there, and some victims' family members, I assume, never get there. But that was the way Sandy Miller felt that she could finally begin that healing process, was to connect with William Bonin's mother. And she said in one of these news articles, I'm not necessarily against the death penalty, but I question its value in healing victims' family members. And maybe if Mr. Bonin had had a chance to get the kind of help he needed early on, this crime would not have happened. And you know, I think that kind of sums up, for me anyway, what is possible in our society. And we can't expect victims' family members to begin this process on our timeline, but we have to make it available to them, I think.
So I just have two quick comments. Death penalty focus, part of our organization has California crime victims seeking alternatives to the death penalty. In the last year, it's grown by 100 more members, so we now have over 700 members. Included in that membership are individuals whose the perpetrator of the crime is either serving LWOP or on death row, and some of them have on their own met the defendant, the offender, because they want that kind of closure. They want to ask why. They want to face that person. And they feel that that has really helped them far more than a system that keeps the two apart, and there is no way to bring the two together. So I think that's so important.
I think, and I agree with that. That the David Edwin Mason had met with one of the victims of his 7 murders that he committed up in Alameda County back in the 80s, and she forgave and didn't want him executed. But again, there were still other victims in that group that certainly wanted him to die in the gas chamber. So I think it's a much more difficult conversation when you narrow the scope and you have only the worst of the worst on that row.
And the second point that I just want to make is before I left San Quentin, we started a restorative justice program there. It was very small, and I didn't think it would get to be very big, and I was just there last week, and there's so many lifers in that program, and it was amazing to me how quickly it has grown and how many victim family members have asked to be a part of it. And the insight that the inmates have after being involved in this was unbelievable.
But this is a great point of why victims need, and victims groups need to be here at these conversations, because talking among ourselves, it's great. We all think alike, or most of us. So, but it really accomplishes very little. So we need to start, the next year you need to invite some victims groups, Scott, to...
It's the next panel, actually.
Oh, good, great, perfect. Excellent, yeah. I guess I should look at the agenda. So I have a question for Judge Alarcon, and I asked it earlier, and that was, do you think the standard of ineffective assistance of counsel should be raised in cases that are for the death penalty, given the finality of the punishment?
Well, that's one of the problems here in California. The Supreme Court has very high standards in trying to find people to handle both the automatic appeal and also habeas corpus. There are not a lot of lawyers who are willing to get involved in a process that may have them tied up for the next 25 or 30 years.
I'm talking about at the trial court level, though, Judge. I mean,
well, at the trial court level,
standard of review.
I come from Los Angeles County. I was a Los Angeles County prosecutor. The Los Angeles Public Defender's Office is outstanding. Some of their lawyers who specialize in death penalty cases do a superb job in representing their clients. So I don't think, at least in Los Angeles County, it may not be the same in some of the other 57.
Well, if you go to Modesto, or you go to Alpine County, or you go to some of these smaller counties where they don't have as many highly qualified people as they have in the LA County office.
Well, I think in those counties there is a problem. Over half of the death penalty cases come from Los Angeles County, where they are well represented by very effective counsel in the Public Defender's Office.
They're good in the lifer hearings, too.
Having read many of the appellate records in capital cases, I can pretty much identify the problem. And of course, I am a public defender, so I'm not about to criticize public defender offices. But so often, the court-appointed panel attorneys that get appointed for these cases, in many cases I've seen, do shockingly poor jobs, and they get paid
I agree.
flat fees, $125,000 flat fee to do a capital case. I have one, I just finished the opening brief. I asked the trial attorney for his file, and all he could come up with were the documents that were turned over in discovery by the DA's office. That was it, the murder book, portions of the murder book from
Well,
the DA's office.
I
He did no work up
I
at
have
all.
friends that I went to law school with that were trying death penalty cases their third year out of law school. I mean, it's ridiculous. So for me, I'm suggesting that the standard needs to be raised for death cases on review, that people who are involved in death cases have a higher standard of competence necessary and have to be screened before they can, even if you got to go out of county to get a lawyer, I think you got to do it, because we're going to import some people from Los Angeles or some of the larger counties that can afford to have the most qualified and most selective people trying death penalty and homicide cases, because frankly, it is shocking.
Because if you don't get the representation there, there's almost nothing we can do at the appellate level. I've been working as a state public defender for 20 years. I've never had a reversal of any one of my capital cases. The first person I've had success with was Frankie Carrillo, which I did pro bono on the side. You know, not in my office, never in my office.
Well, I just want to
Good
say,
client.
for the new lawyers here, I think it's really important that you understand there is a huge difference in the skill level required for a garden variety felon trial lawyer and a homicide lawyer. You go to that next level, that, in my view, is a much more difficult legally, conceptually, presentation-wise, defense of. And then you go to the next level, which is being death penalty qualified, which I was in Sacramento County. And we had to go through a judge screening process with the trial court judges and show my continuing education of the bar and what I knew about it and all those things. But when you get to that level of responsibility where you have to investigate backgrounds, you have to go out to the field, and you have to turn over every stone for the penalty phase, if you are not an experienced trial lawyer with the intellect, because there's a lot of law work in here. It's not just all about getting up in front of the jury and talking. You have to understand the law, and you have to understand law in motion. You have to be able to argue this stuff in front of very competent judges who understand this stuff, and to be able to defend your client. The skill level required is so high, and we just aren't giving people that kind of competent representation, and it's shameful.
Okay, thank you so much. And now, questions from the audience. Yes.
Hi.
We need a microphone for this. Seth? Is there one up here?
There's one on the stand there.
I can just talk loudly. Can you all hear me? Yeah. My name is Joe Hartnett. I have kind of a burning desire. I think my heart is on fire. I'm here on behalf of the Pacific Film Foundation, who, along with my late, really beloved partner, Herb Blake, who will be honored later today, we began developing a feature documentary called Life Without, go figure. And we went to San Quentin in November, and through the help of Rose Elizondo. Rose, are you here? And we went to a restorative justice circle, and there were survivors or victims, and there were 30 men in blue, and we sat in circles. And we met members of the Kid Cat group, 4 of them that my partner and I talked with. And we talked with Troy Williams, who was given some cameras by Discovery Channel and Radical Media 5 years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, and they are beginning to produce a weekly show. Here's my question. I'm sorry for the long preamble, but you'll see what I mean. Our understanding is that now when we want to go back, the tenor of what can come out of San Quentin has changed. It's also been on lockdown, if I'm not mistaken, due to a riot or something.
There was a riot.
There was a riot. So here's my question. What is your opinion of the ability of inmates, including LWOPs, as you call them, or people serving life without, to actually be able to tell their story to someone and to get that message out of the prison?
So are you asking what the media rules are? Because, I mean,
Yeah.
the rules as they are in California today are that you cannot go in and interview a specific inmate. You can ask to go into the prison for a project and randomly interview inmates, but you cannot, as I said, go in and ask to see Charlie Manson as an example, because that's the one everybody used to want to go see. You can visit inmates in the visiting room and document what they have to say. They can call you. You can record those calls that you're in, but having camera access you will not get if it's for a specific inmate.
I don't see that changing. I don't see that changing because it is such a controversial. People are worried that the defendants are going to try to glorify their stories and, you know, profit off of this in some way, and it really is a very difficult thing to do. So I think you're going to be, as Jeannie has suggested, I think you're going to be limited to group types things and specific projects. I don't think you're going to be individual.
Yeah, I do need to comment on that just a little bit further. I have mixed emotions about the rule, and here's why. Because when the media could come in and ask to interview an inmate, guess who they asked to interview? Charlie Manson, Richard Ramirez. And those, when that's all the public sees, it's very hard to get them to think about criminal justice in a very different kind of way and to understand that Charlie Manson and Richard Ramirez are like 1% of the population. The rest of the population is a very different kind of person.
Well, there are some projects that are harmful. I mean, like in my opinion, Lockdown, that white trash TV show that portrays inmates as violent. I don't see how that's productive. So.
I agree. The only thing I want to say to it is what we're trying to tell are stories of people who have been are freer walking around this world right now. And that's the story we want to tell. And so why wouldn't prison corrections all the way up to the top want that story to be told?
Not all people are as well-intentioned as you.
If I could intervene, we need to prevent the back and forth on
Talk
the
to me
same
afterwards.
question and let another question.
You have to be
in.
creative.
Afterwards, it'd be great if you talked about it. We have another one in the back.
Yes, my name's Dan Elba, and I want to go back to the original question about principles of restorative justice in a society that's free of the death penalty, so that I understand from each of you the parameters of restorative justice as you understand them. Are there any particular instances or exceptions to the rule where the death penalty actually can exist in a restorative justice society? I mean, how absolute is that definition? And then, given the fact that restorative justice is about respect, forgiveness, love, and graciousness, it is also political, and it's also religious. And so, in many cases, if you're looking at providing an open door access to dialogue with those who oppose it, would that not be something of consideration so that we can talk about this with those who are absolutely against restorative justice and want the death penalty?
Well, I said in my paper, which I didn't get to, unfortunately, is that I thought if in fact we can't repeal the death penalty, we ought to start with a more modest approach, and that is making some of those cases eligible under 1170D with the agreement of the prosecutor and the victims and the inmate to be recalled and resentenced under life. So I think it is possible as a compromise to do some of those things.
And just the other two, if you have a...
No.
No.
Yeah, Michael. Being part of the board, parole board, I know you're familiar with the Vogue program, right? Is there any way that the parole board can be active in trying to get this program implemented in level 4s? Because that's where a lot of the lifers and violent crime offenders are. And if you could, if there's any way your advocacy from the parole board to get it implemented throughout the state.
Unfortunately, the parole board is a hearing board, and that's really where they are limited to be involved. We have a deputy director now of programs, Elizabeth Siggins, And that's where those programs and the programs expansions come. We have a new director of adult institutions, Rich Subia, who is, I really like Rich myself, and I think he would be very helpful to you in that. But the board really has no involvement in the development of programs from my perspective.
That's true. It really is incumbent upon the Department of Corrections. And, you know, I think there's some good news with the Department of Corrections. You know, one of the reasons that the R has been silent is because of overcrowding. And through realignment and the orders of the court, the overcrowding is coming down. And very quickly, it will be down to where the court says it needs to be. And the department just is now very thoughtfully redesigning what it's going to look like when the inmate population is where it should be, and they're talking a lot about programs. And so I think you're going to see a very different Department of Corrections in about 3 years. That's about how long it will take.
Over here, thank you. My name is Dr. Mai Phung Nguyen. I'm coming here as a concerned citizen, as a child refugee from the Vietnam War, and as somebody very interested in public health as well as patient health. I wanted to first thank you very much for this incredibly great panel. This is not my field at all, and I thank you for sharing your very painful stories and inspiring stories. My question is, in the 20th anniversary of the LA riots, where there's so many different things that contributed to it, I was a young medical student across the way at USC at the time, and I had what I would have considered a post-traumatic stress disorder experience when I saw LA go up into flames, because that's kind of what I experienced on April 29th, 1975, you know, to the day, several years previously. And it's so easy for people to say, to oversimplify crime, you know, they did this because of that. And it's always about root causes, and healing is deep and it's very complicated. So when we hear Charles Manson, you know, he's obviously a very disturbed human being. And in my field of healthcare, it's too easy to simply say, well, you're just sick. There are always root causes. You're not just fat and lazy. You grew up with bad habits. You grew up not having role models for good eating or exercise. So my question to you is, 20 years after the LA riots, you want to change how the society is looking at justice system, the penal code, and imposing or spreading restorative justice. How can we change the dialogue so that it's talking about root causes? Because where you're standing, it's always the end of the line. It's downstream, and what is so much more cost effective, as with healthcare, it's about upstream and prevention. So, I mean, it's such a big question. It's so huge. But I think we start by talking about root causes. People just don't go and kill people. It's so complicated. You know, they come from histories of violence. They come from, and the cycle repeats itself until you intervene effectively.
I do think a lot of that has started in California. We're kind of behind a lot of states, but it has started. And juvenile justice realignment is one piece of that. Crime is going down. It's going down among juveniles in the entire state of California. There's more of an evidence-based treatment focus. Schools are getting involved, looking at truancy and trying to, instead of punishing people for being truant, trying to identify what the core causes are. There's all the family-focused therapy that's popping up all around the state. I think the future is really bright in that area, but I also absolutely believe that ending the death penalty is so critical to our thinking holistically about the entire system.
The problem we have with funding programs like you're talking about is business is cyclical. You probably have a business school here at LMU, and business is cyclical. And when there's no money and the economy goes in the tank like it has for the last 4 years, all the discretionary programs get cut. Corrections, they get cut at corrections, they get cut at the local level. And what are those programs? Those are programs like restorative justice. Those are programs like substance abuse. Those are programs like mental health. Those are programs that are preventative in nature, in education. So I think it's a real problem.
Hi, I just want to thank you very much for the panel this morning. My name is Julia Chavez, and I just wanted to make a comment about part of the spirit of the restorative justice movement is that we actually stop labeling and and using certain language and defining people a certain way. And if we could all start remembering to, instead of calling people inmates or prisoners, if we start referring to them as people in prison or people who are incarcerated. Thank you.
Well, let me comment on that, because I do think that we need to change the penal code, and we need to change the language that we use when we talk about the criminal justice system. Inmates, convicts, you know, we need to change that language. And when we changed it in 1991, I think it was, we changed the penal code from you go to prison for rehabilitation to prison for punishment. We have a punishment model, and the language we use around it is a punishment model. It's to separate people from society and lock them up. And we need to change that conversation in order to change those words.
Is the mic on?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm the president of Christian Legal Aid of Los Angeles, and part of my job duties is engaging communities of faith, in particular followers of Jesus, about the justice for the poor and the underserved in our communities. We started off this morning with a prayer that was quoting from the book of Matthew, chapter 25, and the parable of the sheep and goats, and who were separated, the sheep who would go to heaven and the goats that would go to eternal fire. And one of the distinctions in that prayer and in that parable is those who go to who visit those who are in prison, and who engage in that type of justice in prison ministry and programs of that reach out to somebody that has no opportunity. Do you know what, if anything, is being done in terms of engaging communities of faith about the importance of restorative justice in the prison reform system and in capital punishment?
Well, I can tell you, I just had a conversation with somebody this morning from Sacramento who we're short 26 Catholic priests in the prison system across the state. I happen to know this gentleman from Sacramento. He's a volunteer chaplain in Folsom. He asked me about if the department would be open to volunteer chaplaincy across the state. So we are starting to reach out, and the faith communities are starting to reach out to us, and we're starting to reach out to the faith communities. And I think the faith communities need to be involved, need to be more involved than they are currently.
And that's actually how the restorative justice program started at San Quentin. But San Quentin, you know, is where it's situated, it's always been open to volunteers. So my last year there, we had 3,000 volunteers coming into the prison for a variety of programs. Now I understand there are up to 6,000 volunteers coming in each year. So it really, if you have people who are interested in entering the prison system, you need to meet with the director of corrections. When I was the director, Alternatives to Violence came and met with me and said, well, go into any prison you'll let us in. I said, go into them all. And so they now have that program in about 75% of the prisons. And so that's what you need to do. And the doors will open for you if you have a really good idea and a really good program that you can present to Secretary Kate or to the Director of Corrections.
And his name is Rich Subia. So you can find him, and you should talk to Ray Leonardini right down here in the front, who's a volunteer chaplain at Folsom State Prison, who's also involved in trying to expand the faith communities.
Raise your hand, Ray.
And I just want to say one other thing. Inmates told me this a long time ago, and forgive me for the language, but it is the language that's used in prisons. When the rest of the world walked away from us, the religious community did not. They were the ones coming in and being coaches on our baseball team, doing all the things that the taxpayers and the legislature had removed money from the prisons doing, that we had. And so they value that so much. And so I really hope that you will help open the doors to the prison and bring in some of the programs that exist at San Quentin to all the other prisons.
And all of you should volunteer.
And over here, next.
First and foremost, I want to express the appreciation for the knowledge the panel is demonstrating, particularly you, Mike, being on the parole board, being a convict yourself. I, too, am a product of the California Department of Corrections. My uncle has been there for 40 years. I was there for 15 years. And my little brother is now doing an 18-year stretch. What I wanted to ask you, from the perspective of the level 4 inmates, the lifers, which in a lot of cases, especially for the families that I can witness now, a death sentence would have been much more lenient in my uncle's regard than what we're watching him go through now. He is an intelligent, almost genius-like mentality that has been gone for 40 years, has certain political and religious beliefs that have him stuck and barred, and you know exactly what I'm speaking of. But to see what my mother, sitting in the corner there, and my grandmother have went through, he's a prolific writer, very intelligent, all the way down to the point where he doesn't speak any longer. I've been on the yard, and I watched the mental dilapidation of people who have been, once they hit that 25, 30-year mark, it's mentally like almost downhill from there. And it's ridiculous, it's sad, and I am too now. Well, the reason why I call it as the language of the prisoners of the California Department of Corruption, because as much in education and everything else that I've got there, I am now witnessing, after being in society for 7 years consistently, the psychological disease that comes along with institutionalization and the type of society that is not set up. I am pegged and stereotyped in so many different ways, from being a black man to a convict to a Muslim. I got so many different stereotypes coming at me and stagnating me in this society where the prison never even prepared me for anything like this. So my question to you is, what does the parole board, are they really considering letting anybody out of prison anymore? Thank you.
Well, I can't speak for the parole board. I actually can't speak for the Department of Corrections, but what I can tell you is what's public information. And that is that there have been more grants in the last several years of prisoners with life that has gone up for under the Davis regime, Wilson, Duke Bajan. There were very few people that got grants. I think in the 4 years there might have been 50 grants that were given across the board. I don't know how many. I think Governor Wilson let out one. Davis let out one by force on his way out. Four. And then now under Governor Brown, who happens, and actually I should give Governor Schwarzenegger some credit because he actually did release. There were actually, in his term of 8 years, I believe there were about 179 inmates that were released for out to parole. A lot of them came from Los Angeles. Today, this governor, and I can tell you, I wrote the paper for the governor about how to use the Lawrence and Chaputis decisions and decision-making and what they should do to review when he looks at it, because he has the right to look at it from a de novo perspective, a new perspective. He's let out over 80% of the inmates that have come to him for grants. And there have been over 300 releases in the last year. You guys would probably know better than I do about what number of releases, but there's been over 300. It was just in the paper the other day. It's over 300 releases. So there are more releases. And the decisions in Lawrence, Chaputis, and some of the other cases, I think there was actually a recent case that you sent me, but more people are getting out. More need to get out.
We need to...
Can I just say the recidivism rate?
Yes.
The recidivism rate of the individuals that have gotten out is 0.5 of 1%. And none have returned for a violent crime. None.
I am sorry that we have to cut off for questions, and because I'm the moderator, I do want to say personal feeling is that life in prison with no possibility ever of parole is death in prison. It's another death sentence. I think that's the next avenue that we have to be looking down. We have to start with the lid of the garbage can, however, which I believe is the death penalty, and then take it from there. But European countries, most civilized nations do not have the death penalty or life in prison with no possibility of parole. I know one European said, we figure if we cannot rehabilitate a human being in 25 or 30 years, then that's our fault, and we need to look at our system. And I think that's the attitude we have to have here. So I want to thank all of you so much. Thank you, panelists. It was very, very interesting. Thank you so much.